Jesus was a descendant of not one, not two, but three sexually exploited women, and the lineage contained in Matthew, we're told, is a descendant of Bathsheba, who was unequivocally sexually exploited. We often get that wrong, but she was. Tamar and Rahab as well. And so it's as if God was winking to us, saying, I get it. Understanding and compassion for victims is in the DNA, the very blood of Christ. Jesus himself was a near victim of child abuse and would have been murdered but for an act of child protection. When Herod wanted to kill Jesus, God didn't swoop down with a legion of angels. He gave a warning to the Magi, a warning to Joseph, who presumably passed it on to Mary, and they all acted to save the baby Jesus. Your church wouldn't be here if it weren't for an act of child protection. So maybe God is telling us something with that recorded account in the Bible.
You are listening to the Gird Up Podcast, an unapologetically Lutheran voice for the ordinary Christian. Today our guest is Victor Veith, and he's joined us for a conversation about how Christian communities can identify and address and prevent physical, spiritual, and sexual abuse in our communities. Before we get to that, though, I want to encourage you to be a part of the work that we are doing here at Gird Up. First, make sure you follow and subscribe to this episode and this show, and then leave a rating or review on whatever platform you consume this content on. And if you'd like to support the work we do here at Gird Up, please consider making a donation. We call it a cup of coffee donation because for the price of a cup of coffee, you can help fund the work we are doing here at Gird Up as we flood the internet with confessional content and help prepare the people of God for whatever lies ahead. Go to www.girdupministries.com, select Buy Us a Cup of Coffee in the main menu, and make your donation there. If you want to stay connected, sign up for the Gird Up Dispatch, our weekly email with updates, resources, and encouragement to help you stand firm in Christ. You'll find the sign-up link down in the show notes below. And finally, if you've got questions or topics you want us to address or guests you want to hear me interview, send those suggestions our way via the link in the show notes. Today's episode is sponsored by Grace in Action. Grace in Action provides the leadership, support, tools, and training that you need to see beyond the day-to-day and take the important steps that move your ministry forward by taking an intentional Christian approach to using leadership tools and best practices to help specifically WELS or ELS ministries, called workers, and lay leaders wisely invest their talents, time, and treasure for God's kingdom. If you'd like to know more about Grace in Action, go to grace-in-action.com or find the link down in the show notes below. Thank you to Grace in Action for sponsoring today's episode. With all that said, pull up a chair, take a seat, and let's talk about Jesus for a while. All right, our guest today, Mr. Victor Veith, is a titan in the field of child advocacy and a confessional Lutheran voice who has trained thousands of professionals across the globe. He's written or contributed to a number of books and projects and has penned a plethora of papers and articles on the subject. He's the director of the Center for Faith and Child Protection at the Zero Abuse Project. He brings a unique blend of legal expertise along with law and gospel theology to the table. This conversation isn't an easy one. It's often a tough one to have, but I think absolutely worthwhile. So thank you, Victor, for being here on the show with us today.
Thanks, Charlie, for having me with you. It's good to be here today.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I guess I want to start just simply by asking, how did you get here? How did you, you've got a legal background. You're a Lutheran by confession. How do you end up in a position where you're leading an organization that specializes in this kind of advocacy?
It wasn't my intention when I went to law school. In fact, when I went to law school, I was thinking of a career in public policy and actually thought about working as a public defender for a while because that seemed pretty noble. Then I graduated. The first job I got after I clerked for a judge was as a rural prosecutor here in my home state of Minnesota, and they assigned me to handle child protection, child abuse cases. And I remember a few weeks into the job, I was trying a termination of parental rights case, and I had a witness on the stand who was grilled by the defense attorney about all the things he did wrong, and one of the things he did wrong is he removed a baby from the home without legal authority, and he became emotional under the duress of cross-examination. Said, "Look, I went into the house. Baby was unresponsive. Baby was on the floor, covered with maggots. I just instinctively scooped up the infant and took the child to the hospital. I didn't know what I was doing," he said. I was so moved by that. I remember going home that night, talking to my wife, saying, "I think I know what I want to do. I want to be a child protection attorney." And so I never looked back. I was in the field for a decade, and we did some novel things. Actually got national attention for our success in responding to child abuse, and so I got tapped to work at the national level. I went to our nation's capital, worked with the National District Attorneys Association, launched a number of national initiatives, and so now for 28 years I've been working at the national level, providing training, child assistance publications to child abuse investigators and prosecutors. Now, what brought me to the issue of religion and child abuse, I was always troubled as a prosecutor. It wasn't unusual to go to court and you'd have a case of child abuse and you'd see pastors show up as character witnesses for the accused, and elders and congregants would show up and be in the gallery for the alleged offender. I never once had a pastor or a congregant show up on behalf of an alleged victim. And I remember going to court once, and 12-year-old girl had accused her dad, who was an elder at her Protestant church, of sexually abusing her. And she came in and saw all these religious leaders, including both her pastors, there. And they didn't come to court to support her, that was for sure. They were there to support her dad. And so she tugged on my suit and whispered in my ear, "Does this mean that God is against me too?" So it was always bothersome to me. And then I was working for the National District Attorneys Association. I got a call from a prosecutor in California who said, "Today in our Children's Advocacy Center, we interviewed a 7-year-old girl who was sexually abused by her dad. And at the end of the interview, we said, 'We've asked you a lot of questions. Do you have any questions for us?' And the girl got nervous, twirled her hair, looked at her toes, and said, 'Yeah, I'm just sort of wondering, am I still a virgin in God's eyes?' It's a mental health question for sure. It's also a spiritual question. Well, how do we respond to such an inquiry? The prosecutor asked me. I was so intrigued by that, we began to collect similar anecdotes. We began to hit the books, and I was shocked, still am shocked at how much research is out there on the spiritual impact of abuse, research that has been so widely, almost universally ignored by both faith and child protection leaders. And so I've done a lot in the last quarter of a century trying to bring faith and child protection leaders closer together and to figure out a game plan for addressing the physical, the emotional, and the spiritual impact of trauma.
Yeah. I I want to ask you specifically about what trauma like that can do to a person's faith, or even I like the words that I picked up from one of your writings, distorting the victim's view of God's character. But before we even get into that, I want to ask you a personal question.
Mhm.
You've just been kind of living in this reality for a long time, right? This kind of swampy world of abuse, especially dealing with young people and with children. I have very limited experience, but I've worked with a number of kids in my teaching career who've um, been either physically or sexually abused, and it just was a massive toll on me, even in that little snippet, right? And continues, frankly, to be something challenging for me how many years later, just as somebody observing and trying to help wherever I can. How do you, as somebody who's just seeing these things constantly, kind of living in that world, how do you maintain, I guess, your faith? That's not the right way to ask that question, but how do you keep from being just burned out by all this?
Yeah, vicarious trauma is a real issue in my field, and many folks who do this work are unable to stay for a longer period of time. I've been in it though for 38 years, and I think I've been able to stay by being aware of vicarious trauma and taking proactive steps. So one of the things we do at my organization is we've got a buddy system, and it rotates periodically. So let's say, Charlie, you and I were buddies. One of your obligations to me would be to say, what's your self-care plan for the next year? What are several things you're going to do to take care of yourself? And it has to be realistic. So if you want to go on a trip to Europe, but you can't afford that, you don't put that on your list. So it has to be something realistic. For me, it might be, I love baseball, and I've always had on my bucket list to see a St. Paul Saints game. I fulfilled that goal last summer. So it has to be realistic stuff like that. So you'd be checking in on me, Victor. Have you gone to a Saints game? Do you have the tickets bought? Right? What are you doing here to check the boxes on your self care plan? And I would owe the same obligation to you. Periodically have meetings where the only rule is we're just not talking about child abuse today. We're talking about family and friends and music. And has anybody seen a great movie or read a good book recently? Um, and then making space for long walks and enjoying a sunset when the weather permits it. I'm a huge Johnny Cash fan, so my wife always knows if I just block out 3 hours one night, I'm playing Johnny Cash music really loud. I just need to decompress and get caught up in the rhythmic boom chicka boom sound of Johnny Cash. Prayer is really helpful, and I try to end each night by reading a little bit of the Old and New Testament to ground myself. That although many people are not all that interested in protecting children from abuse, and the church, sadly, sinfully, has been indifferent for a long period of time, God is trauma informed, and this was a high priority for Jesus, and that can bring uh, extraordinary comfort. Got a great wife. That's really helpful. I've got some good friends. That can be helpful as well.
I'm gonna latch onto two things and ask a couple of
Mhm,
follow-ups. First, you said you got a great wife, and that
mhm,
helps.
mhm.
As a bachelor myself, I can't skip the opportunity to ask, what should I be looking for so that someday I can say I got a great wife and that helps?
I think the most important thing is sharing faith. My wife Lisa and I have very little in common. We don't like the same type of music or movies or recreation. She's a little more adventuresome than I am and loves to travel. I'm more like, can we go to a library and check out a really good book? She's more gregarious. I'm more soft spoken and shy. We don't agree politically. We just don't agree on very many things, but we do share uh, a confessional Lutheran Christian faith, and that has allowed each of us to comfort the other on gray days and to approach the hardships that come to everybody through a shared faith in Christ. So, my advice would be the most important thing is a shared faith, and with a shared faith, you can overcome any differences. In fact, you'll find yourself growing, right? Because you, out of love, say, I need to listen to some of the music you like, or some of the movies, or some of the books that you're reading. So you actually grow better as a person out of Christian love for one another.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
That's great. That's good advice. The second thing I want to latch onto there is you said that the church has been indifferent to
Yeah.
protecting children from abuse for quite a while. What makes you say that? It's a pretty bold claim and a blanket statement. Um, I guess I just invite you to back it up, maybe, if that's the right way to say that.
Yeah. Pretty easy to back it up. Um, for 2,000 years, we've largely ignored the issue of child maltreatment in the church. So let's look at today's lay of the land. Even though we know that child abuse happens in faith communities, the widespread scandal in the Catholic Church, the more recent widespread scandal in the Southern Baptist Convention, in our own denomination, the Wisconsin Synod, we've had 8 called workers arrested, charged, some already convicted of abuse in the past year alone. We've had previous cases in the past history of the WELS. I recently went onto 2 websites that try to maintain a database of articles on abuse, and I just Googled Lutheran. I found 50 cases in the 3 largest Lutheran denominations that were, making headlines and news coverage across the country. The LCA, the largest Lutheran denomination, they recently passed. I had a role in helping them with that, their social message on child protection. To their credit, they admitted when they said we need to have this social message that most of our churches don't have policies. A lot of them don't even do a background check, or seminaries are not educating pastors on what does trauma-informed spiritual care look like. We're even less prepared. They acknowledge to address abuse in the home. They did a study in 2023, and I forget the exact numbers, although it's referenced in their social message, that a lot of our bishops are not even, promoting resources to help congregations respond to the sin of maltreatment. They their body has had many social message statements where they say, here's our former theological statement. Well, it's only now that we have a statement on child maltreatment. But let's not pick on the LCA. Where is our former theological statement in the wells? Now, I can give an inside scoop. I know there's a committee form that's working on that, so that's great, and we'll keep them in our prayers. But it took us a long time to implement coursework at our seminary. Now we have some, thanks to John Schutze there. I think it's 15 years I've been doing annual lecture at Martin Luther College, but what was going on before those 15 years? And even though for 15 years or so I've been teaching at MLC, we need policies, we need some basic protections such as personal safety education. I'm not aware of a single WELS school that has a personal safety education course. Now, there's going to be a push for that, and maybe we can implement that reform, but it's the most important thing we can do in our churches and schools. I know many
I'm interested.
congregations that have no policies, right? They'll call me with a issue arising, and my first question is, do you have any sort of policy? And the answer is no. So there's just a lot of work to do. Even the Catholic Church, which has the strongest policies in training, perhaps because they've paid several $billion in damages, or let's put the best construction, Eighth Commandment, because they appreciate the sin. There are scholars who've said even in the Catholic Church, the policies are focusing on let's address sexual abuse within the church, because those are the kids that'll sue us, right? We're not paying equal attention to abuse in the home and so on and so forth. So I can go on and on and on and on, but
Yeah.
there's just very little evidence that we've taken this seriously and that we've been proactive in addressing it. And usually we don't address it at all until there's a scandal, and that's sinful.
Yeah. I'm very interested in hearing you talk about what did you call it? You called it a personal safety
Personal safety
plan, or
education.
yeah,
for children.
Let's make sure we circle back and talk about that before we're done here.
For sure.
But before we do that, I just want to ask, is it getting worse, or is it just more publicity? Like, is the problem, in your perception, is the problem, or maybe you have some stats to I don't know. Is it getting worse, or is it just getting more noticeable, or are we more aware of it now? What do you think the condition is on that side of things?
In society as a whole, it's getting a lot better. So in the last 30 years in the United States, there's been a 60% decline in child sexual abuse, a 60% decline in child physical abuse, 13% decline in child neglect. So not as steep, but still going down. And the reason for that is greater awareness. It is prevention initiatives such as personal safety education in public schools. It is greater media coverage. It is better medical and mental health care, because some abuse is influenced by mental health conditions. So that is making a difference. The growth of what we call children's advocacy centers. When I began 40 years ago, there were less than 25 children's advocacy centers in the United States. Today, there's over 900 serving 90% of the population. So today, if there's a report of abuse, instead of shipping the child to 8 or 9 different people, they go to one center and all the professionals come to them. All the professionals meet rigorous standards for being trauma informed. And the CACs also take a leadership role in implementing prevention initiatives throughout their jurisdiction. So these and other initiatives have made a profound difference. Criminal justice has improved dramatically. When I began, there was no such thing as a crimes against children unit at a police department. Today, at least in large law enforcement agencies, that's the norm. People do nothing but respond to these cases, specialized prosecutors, so on and so forth. So things are so much better than they were 4 decades ago. Now, it doesn't seem that way. But the reason it doesn't seem that way is because we're doing so much better, right? We're catching more people. People are getting charged. People are getting arrested. People are being caught online. Online crimes are skyrocketing. But the good news of technology is it's also made it possible for us to catch really sometimes sophisticated offenders who wouldn't have been caught otherwise. So the world is getting better as a whole. Now, is it getting better in the faith community? I would argue maybe a little bit, but we're behind many secular institutions. So, if we circle back to the issue of personal safety education, most public schools in the United States, as a result of what's called Aaron's Law legislation, they're required to educate youth of what do you do if you're being abused in home or at school or at your church or elsewhere. What do you do? What are your options, right? Um, and we know that sort of education increases disclosures. It does not increase false reports, the research says. And even if a child doesn't want to come forward after the education because they don't want their mom or dad, who's the typical abuser, to get into trouble, they now know this is a safe place. I've got teachers and others who care about me. And so that is operating as a buffer. Well, every Catholic school in the United States does personal safety education. That's a common sense reform as a result of the lawsuits. But again, how many of the 1,400 ELCA schools, how many of our Wells or Missouri Synod or Baptist or other Protestant schools implement that? It's pretty rare, right? And so I challenge my Christian friends, is it really a good witness of our faith to have moral standards that are below the public school system?
It's an excellent question, and it shouldn't be rhetorical.
No,
It shouldn't be
shouldn't be.
rhetorical.
Right.
So to that point, I in part of so I in a couple of conversations, I had a couple of conversations with pastors and some of my peers and so forth, getting ready for this, just asking what I should talk to you about. And somebody made the statement to me, I thought it was really interesting, that we don't want to or even need to, many of us, apologize for growing up in households where we couldn't have even imagined like physical or sexual abuse. It's a wonderful thing. It's a blessing. It's a blessing almost unique to our Christian faith as well. And like we don't want to go there, right? But at the same time, we need to be protective and proactive and vigilant about preventing future abuse or abuse that's already occurring from continuing. And one of the things that I gets pointed out a lot is just how naive, and you hinted at this earlier when you talked about all these character witnesses showing up on behalf of the accused, and I think you said never in your experience on the side of the victim. As Christians, we're just tend to be naive about what's going on, what measures need to be taken for protection, so forth. My first question, I guess, is why are we so easy to fool, and what can we do about that?
Yeah, research helps us sort that out as well. There's research which says most people engage in cognitive dissonance, which means in cases of child abuse, almost all of us are opposed to child abuse. The only ones who wouldn't be opposed are the offenders themselves. So almost everybody's opposed to child abuse. It's a horrible thing when we contemplate it. The problem is, although we're opposed to it in the abstract, we're not usually opposed to it when we see it. Because when we actually see it, the alleged offender is in our family, they're in our church, they're at our favorite college or seminary or other institution. It's somebody who's been a mentor to us. It's somebody we've admired for a long period of time. And so our brain protects ourselves, and we flood our memories with all the good things this person has done. I remember when my mama died, my sainted mother went to heaven, and the pastor came at 2 a.m. and helped me make all these decisions and was so kind and comforting through this really hard part of my life. And so we flood our memory with all those those good things this alleged offender has done. And then, because we're not trauma informed, we don't educate ourselves very much about the dynamics of abuse. We often look at the alleged victim and say, who could ever believe a kid like that? They've been in and out of juvenile court. They abused their body with drugs or alcohol. We've caught them in a whole host of lies in the past. They've got a wide variety of mental health issues. How could anybody possibly take the word of that child? And so we rally around the offender and we ostracize the child victim. And we rarely actually ever pay attention to what led the government to make an arrest or file a charge, right? To charge somebody, you have to say ethically, I think I can prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, which is the highest legal standard in the American system of jurisprudence. So maybe common sense should say, I wonder if the government knows something I don't know. Maybe we should honor that little verse in Romans and step back and let the government do their job and not jump to a conclusion. You can't overcome that without education. But with education, you'd say, well, wait a minute. A sex offender is extraordinarily good at manipulating not just their victim, but research says they also groom me, they groom the congregation, they groom their family, they spend a lot of time creating this good aura for precisely this moment in time that nobody would believe that they could commit this crime if and when it's ever discovered. And the fact that the victim has a wide variety of challenges, actually research says that's the ideal victim. The offender, who's, say, a sex offender, would violate anyone they're attracted to, but they often look for the low-hanging fruit, the person who's kind of drifted away from the herd, so to speak. And if you're abusing your body with alcohol or drugs, if you're suffering from depression or other mental health conditions, oftentimes those are signs that you've already endured trauma, typically in your birth home or in another setting, and they're just easy targets for you, and you end up violating them all over again. So once you're educated about that, you can educate yourself to step back. Plus, you need to be educated to say, wait a minute, I cannot make a decision here. I have too many biases. I know the offender. I've known the alleged offender for 20 years. I cannot make a fair judgment here. I need to step back and I need to have neutral law enforcement, or if they won't investigate, a neutral third party take a look at this case, because I am way too close to the situation to make a fair and impartial judgment. So that's the primary reason. It's rooted in our ignorance. But I would add, conscious ignorance is also a sin, and we have consciously chosen to be ignorant in the Christian church, and we need to change that dynamic.
Yeah, and I'll just add a little anecdotal experience again. I've had the awesome opportunity to work on a child safeguarding policy over the last few months, and just diving through. And I happen to be in South Carolina at the moment, so just walking through the legal jargon, I guess, the actual laws of South Carolina, and then also walking through the child safeguarding policy guide, which is excellent. It's an excellent resource. Like, there were a number of times where I'm reading through and going like, oh, I've done this, or you're reading through and you go, I've seen this, right? And that was a mind bender for me, and I think appropriately so, really burdened my conscience for a while. It was just ignorance, right? How do we get Christian communities as a whole? It's wonderful to have individuals, but what we really need is Christian communities as a whole to step entirely out of ignorance, right? How do we make that happen?
Yeah, I think it begins with theology. I think it begins with a recognition of who it is that we worship as a God. Jesus was a descendant of not one, not two, but three sexually exploited women, and the lineage contained in Matthew, we're told, was a descendant of Bathsheba, who was unequivocally sexually exploited. We often get that wrong, but she was. And Tamar and Rahab as well. And so it's as if God was winking to us, saying, yeah, I get it. Understanding and compassion for victims is in the DNA, the very blood of Christ. Jesus himself was a near victim of child abuse and would have been murdered but for an act of child protection. When Herod wanted to kill Jesus, God didn't swoop down with a legion of angels. He gave a warning to the Magi, a warning to Joseph, who presumably passed it on to Mary, and they all acted to save the baby Jesus. So sometimes I run into people who say, "Oh, child protection is just secular. It's just woke. It's just," I mean, they just say really bizarre things. And my response always is, well, your church wouldn't be here if it weren't for an act of child protection. So, maybe God is telling us something with that recorded account in the Bible. And then it gets better. Jesus, contrary to the culture of his time, lifted up children. He says children are messengers from God. How we treat the child says at the end of the day what we really think about God. He says, better a millstone around your neck thrown in the sea than to hurt a child. Said that on Judgment Day, a lot of clergy and others who think they've done great works will be shocked that they won't make it into heaven because they failed to care for the least of these. I mean, he just lifted up children everywhere, and it was so countercultural to his era. One historian, Lloyd DeMoss, says when Jesus was walking on the earth, he lived in an atmosphere of child sexual abuse. The Roman Greco custom was to sexually violate children, particularly boys. They would have gymnasiums where the men would wrestle naked with adolescent boys. It turned into sexual activity. Pederasty was thought to be enlightened, meaningful sex. Some say that's what Apostle Paul was probably referring to when he said, don't exchange natural for unnatural relations. And the early Christians, reflecting the teachings of Jesus, they were aghast at these practices. And there's some early church documents saying, we're going to exclude you from our community if we catch you sexually violating a child. I hope we can talk about corporal punishment in this podcast, because there's no reference to corporal punishment in the New Testament. In fact, one Missouri Synod scholar, I forget who wrote the commentary now, but he says it's striking that when discipline is referenced in the New Testament, it's so countercultural to the harsh corporal punishment that was practiced in that era. There was a custom back then of you're the head of the household and your wife gives birth to a child and you don't want the kid because you're poor or you're just having a bad day or whatever your reason is. It's not the gender you want. It doesn't matter. You could put the kid on the side of the road where they'd likely die from the elements or a beast. Even if they were rescued, it was typically to grow them into slavery or sexual exploitation. That was the lay of the land when Jesus was walking around. And so when you understand that history, suddenly the Gospels take on new meaning. Now it makes perfect sense why the disciples didn't want these snotty-nosed rug rats to approach a rabbi, because that was the norm. But Jesus was countercultural. Don't you dare keep the children away from me. So we don't actually, Charlie, need to do anything new in the church. We need to do something very old and return to these ancient texts, do a deeper dive of the history surrounding these texts, and see Jesus through fresh, new eyes. And then I think everything else will fall into place.
Yeah, let's just go right to that conversation about corporal punishment, right? This would fit again into that conversation of ignorance, right? In fact, most people that are spanking their kids or whatever form of corporal punishment it is, are under the impression that not only is it approved by God and by Scripture, but even some churches will teach it's mandatory, right? Is it when you read through the Old Testament, you see, I think you think of Proverbs and some of these other places, you see clearly where he's talking about sparing the rod and spoiling the child, so forth. I guess, how can you say that Scripture does not promote it? And maybe what is a wise approach to child discipline instead?
Yeah. It's always dangerous to read one or two or three Bible verses in isolation of the 1600 years of sacred texts. It's also unwise not to pay attention to the type of writing engaged here. So the 1600 years in which the Bible was penned, it's really quite remarkable how very few references there are to corporal punishment, which is shockingly countercultural to the era in which it was written, as we discussed. There's no reference to corporal punishment in the New Testament. Instead, we're told not to exacerbate our children. And largely the verses are confined to Proverbs, right, which were turns of phrases, figures of speech, kernels of wisdom. And the writer, Solomon, the inspired writer, is reflecting the customs of that particular era. So there's references to corporal punishment of both children and adults. In fact, the irony is there's more references to the corporal punishment of adults than there are children, and they're referencing the type of corporal punishment that was practiced in that era, which was instruments applied to the back, not the buttocks. There's no concern for wounds. In fact, one proverb says, "Wounds that cleanse, wounds cleanse away evil," something to that effect. They're figures of speech referencing the need for discipline. Here's a better way to look at it. The early church, both Catholic and Protestant, took seriously these verses about corporal punishment of adults. So if you read the Rule of St. Benedict, it talks about you're a wayward monk and you commit an infraction, we'll just tie you to the whipping post, and we'll get you to say your prayers better, or whatever your misconduct is. The Geneva Ordinances, promulgated by Calvin. Calvin said, if you're missing church and you don't have a good excuse, we're going to tie you to the whipping post and whip you publicly, right? So both Catholic and Protestants took those verses pretty seriously and practiced corporal punishment on adults and argued that it was in the Bible. Today, though, when you really force pastors to say, well, how come we don't have whipping posts at our churches anymore? Pastors will say, well, those are figures of speech, turns of phrases. The underlying wisdom here is that there are consequences to our misdeeds. Back then, you got whipped. Today, there are fines and jail sentences and lawsuits and church discipline. We just do things differently. Today, it's the underlying wisdom. Another example, there's a proverb, I'm paraphrasing, but the effect of the proverb is, if a soldier is dying on the battlefield, give them wine. Well, the underlying wisdom is, don't let them die in pain. But today you wouldn't give them wine, you'd give them morphine if you're the medic on the battlefield, right? The underlying wisdom. So what's the underlying wisdom here? We should discipline our children, right? But it wasn't saying from this time forward we have to discipline as was done in the time of Solomon. We are to love God with our heart, our soul, our mind. And so we can pay attention to modern child development research. We can pay attention to research that says when we hit our kids, even spanking on the buttocks, especially if we do it a long time, we may be reducing the gray matter in their brain, which in turn makes it harder for them to control their behaviors. And then we may accelerate the corporal punishment. The next thing I know, I've got a child who's injured. We need to pay attention to research from Tulane University saying corporal punishment works in the next 5 minutes. If you want to immediately change someone's behavior, start hitting them. For example, I don't have one here, but I'm addicted to Mountain Dew. And every year I go for my annual physical, and my doctor says, you're just drinking too much Mountain Dew. Your dad had diabetes. You got to cut this out. And I always nod politely and say, I'm going to change my ways, doc, as I sip on the bottle of Mountain Dew I brought into the exam room. Well, next year, my doctor, instead of giving me the lecture, would take a big stick and start to hit me. I would throw away the bottle of Mountain Dew I brought into the exam room. It would work in those 5 minutes. But I'd stop at a Quick Trip driving home and replenish the drug of my choice. So research from Tulane says that corporal punishment does work in the next 5 minutes, but long term, it's the least effective form of discipline. In fact, they followed parents for several years, some who were using mild corporal punishment, some who were not using corporal punishment at all. And at the end of their research, the kids who'd never been hit were better behaved in 11 of 13 categories, and in the other 2 categories, it was a tie. There was no category behavior where the children who had received corporal punishment were better behaved in the long term. It's not sinful to pay attention to research like that and to begin to apply it in my household. In fact, I would argue it's not responsible parenting to ignore that. I think we also have to do something that's really uncomfortable for us in confessional Lutheran circles. What caused this flood of parenting books that are still on the shelves of many of our church libraries? If you do a deep dive on that history, there was great concern about the 60s, the sexual revolution, a lot of people burning draft cards, and there was great concern what's happened to authority. And so people who wrote some of these books were really reflecting that particular concern, and they began to advocate we need to be stronger disciplinarians of our children. Most of these people were not child development experts. Many of them were not theologians, and we just bought that hook, line, and sinker. And if you actually read some of these books, it's shocking the things that are in there, where you're told not just to hit your children, um, but that it's required by God, and that eventually it'll turn out really well. And so what has happened, and I've seen this over 4 decades, is a lot of kids who don't have good memories of corporal punishment, who were whipped pretty severely, they grow up and they leave our churches. I did a lecture on this subject as a scholar in residence at the Mayo Clinic, and a social worker there came up to me and said, I dreaded this lecture for half a year, but I knew I had to come to it. And then he shared with me, he grew up in the South in an independent fundamental Baptist church where whipping kids bloody is often promoted from the pulpit. And he said, now that I'm an adult, I know I couldn't help but fidget a little bit in a very long church service. But I'd get home Sunday morning. My kids, my parents would tell me to go out and play. Then they'd summon me inside, and I had to confess my sins in church that day. And I really struggled to figure out what I did wrong, but I had to come up with something. And then I had to go out and get a branch and strip it of all its leaves, and then they'd whip me, and they wouldn't stop whipping me till they drew blood. And he said I still have scars on my body as a result. And yet he said to me, I'm still a relatively conservative Christian. I wouldn't feel comfortable in a church where you can debate the deity of Christ and the resurrection of our Lord. But when I go to a conservative church and I talk to the pastor and I share my history of physical abuse, inevitably they say to me, what happened to you was child physical abuse, but God says we have to hit our kids just a little. And I always remember, Charlie, this survivor saying to me, Victor, could you imagine if I went to a pastor and told them of a history of child sexual abuse? No pastor would say, well, what happened to you is rape, but we have to touch the genitals of kids just a little bit. How am I supposed to react when a pastor says to me, after hearing I've got scars on my body from beatings, well, what happened to you is child physical abuse, but we have to hit kids just a little? They are the lost sheep, and they're not comfortable inside many of our churches, and they're also not comfortable in more liberal theological circles. They're just out there, and we have to figure out a way to minister to them. Here's the good news, though. There are a growing number of confessional Lutherans who are getting this right. In the pastoral theology textbook we use at Wisconsin Lutheran Seminary, authored by John Schutze, he says you can make a case that corporal punishment is authorized, but you can't make a case that it's required. What's required is discipline, right? And we have to start getting this Bible teaching right, and we have to grow our sensitivity to the potential for child physical abuse and the large number of adult survivors of child physical abuse who say, yeah, I don't feel comfortable here when we say from the pulpit God wants us to hit kids, or we make a joke about it and people in the congregation laugh. I don't feel this is a safe place for me. Because I tell you, the one thing I know with absolute certainty is that there will be a judgment. And the God who judges us was himself a victim of child physical abuse and emotional abuse. And he was abandoned by his friends. He was also a victim of sexual abuse in the broadest sense. He was executed in the nude, which was part of the cruelty of Roman crucifixion. So he gets it, right? This is the God who will judge us. And we need to up our game theologically.
Yeah. And ignorance of the law does not excuse one from its effect.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
You made an interesting case study that I'd never thought about before with Martin Luther. And
Yeah.
I've read a couple of biographies of Martin Luther. I very much enjoyed Eric Metaxas's biography of Martin Luther. But you brought up an interesting point about the way we interact with the abuse that Luther disclosed in his table talks and other places. And what can we learn from Martin Luther's experience, and what do you see in our churches today that maybe reflects the same problem that we saw in Luther's day?
Yeah. In table talk over, I think, a 10-year period. 3 different times Luther talked about child physical abuse. He said his mother beat him till the blood ran. He said he was beaten so severely he ran away from his father and took great pains for his dad to win him back. And then he speaks about being beaten by school teachers. He said for nothing at all. In fact, one time he says, I didn't get the answer to a question right, but they hadn't even taught me that, and yet I'm getting whipped. So he talks about these experiences and how they influenced him in a negative way, and arguably it influenced him to adopt a gentler style of parenting. He didn't completely abandon the idea of corporal punishment, but he had grave reservations. Ironically, he said what today the Tulane researchers said, but Lutheran's large catechism says, yeah, hitting the kid, the blows on the back, they may work as long as the child is in pain, but long term, it's the least effective form of discipline. So he got it at a meaningful level, probably rooted in his own experiences, and it arguably influenced his writing of the catechism, right? So, in commentary on the fourth commandment, he said it's a two-way street. It's not just that, the kid needs to obey mom and dad, but the parents have responsibility to the child. And it was very countercultural for his era. And we haven't paid attention to that in the Lutheran community. And what I pointed out in the article I wrote, I was so frustrated by all these Luther biographers, and it didn't matter if you were from the conservative or the liberal wing of the Lutheran Academy. These instances of abuse were dismissed. So one biographer says, "Well, yeah, he got beaten, but everybody got beaten back then. So what?" I mean, that is not sensitive to the child physical abuse survivor reading that passage. Or you mentioned in the Taxes book, he actually makes fun of it. Yeah, so he got clubbed in the head, right? And what kid wouldn't get clubbed in the head? He makes fun of it, right? That is not something that would be read very well by a survivor of child physical abuse. And then some just boldly say, well, it's not abuse. Okay, give me that argument. He says his mother beat him till he was bleeding. Why is that not abuse? So a survivor of abuse reads those accounts, and then they may it may resonate. Luther's experiences may resonate with them, and the fact it influenced him to adopt a gentler style of parenting and influenced how he read the Bible. All of that might be comforting to survivors of physical abuse, but we haven't talked about it in that way. We've talked about it in the polar opposite way. And so that article I wrote was to kind of recenter our thinking here and to read Luther through fresh eyes, read them through the eyes of a survivor of child physical abuse. And I think there's great material there that we could draw out that would be comforting to many survivors.
Yeah. There's a similar issue that you've pointed out in a couple of different articles with the way we interact with especially sexual abuse in scripture. Can you talk to that a little bit? I think most people haven't thought about this much. So maybe we should start with how does Christian literature often treat issues of sexual abuse in scripture? What's wrong with the way it's often treated, and how should we approach these accounts instead?
Yeah. First of all, we need to remember there's quite a few accounts of sexual assault in the Bible. And if we sincerely believe the Bible is wholly inspired by the creator of the universe, it must be God wanted us to learn something about these accounts of trauma, right? And just as, we grow our knowledge of leprosy when we talk about the healing of a leper, we need to grow our knowledge of trauma. And I think if we do, we'll begin to see some of these accounts through a fresh lens and be able to talk about them in more trauma-informed and theologically sound way. So let's take the one that has always troubled me the most, which is the sexual exploitation of Bathsheba. Professor Schutze did this pioneering analysis. He looked at a number of Bible commentaries and how they address the issue of Bathsheba, and he found that most of them, 80%, cast either primary or equal blame on Bathsheba for her own sexual exploitation. And Professor Schutze says in his article published in Wisconsin Lutheran Quarterly, he says, well, wait a minute. Where on earth do you get that from the text? Early on, the inspired writer tells us, while all the other kings are away at war, David's up to mischief, right? David is prowling. David is engaging in voyeurism on the roof of the palace. So early on, we're being told that he's the one whose mind is moving far away from God. And then when the writer cuts to Bathsheba, what is she doing? She's bathing in the courtyard. And Schutze points out, well, that's where she would be bathing, right? She's not doing anything wrong. But the writer then really drives the point home and tells us why she's bathing. She's cleansing herself after a menstrual cycle. She's honoring God and what God expected in that era. So in contrast to David, who's neglecting his kingly duties, engaging in voyeurism, she's honoring God, the polar opposite of David and where David's heart is at. Then we're told that David summons her to the palace. And Schutze points out there's no reason to believe she would have assumed she was about to be exploited. David is a man after God's own heart. She would not have expected this. And then the writer is mercifully brief, saying that he uses her, abuses her, sends her back to never be heard from again, no doubt, except for we know the rest of the story. She becomes pregnant. And then the sin just continues to accelerate. It mushrooms to the point where David engineers a murder of her husband and then takes her into the palace. When God intervenes and sends the prophet Nathan, he doesn't send Nathan to both David and Bathsheba, which he could have done. She was now in the palace as part of his concubine. But instead, Nathan goes just to David. And then he tells him this parable, where in that parable, Bathsheba is likened to a helpless ewe lamb. I mean, how much clearer can the writer be to us? And then when David, feigns his outrage, Nathan says, you are the man, not you and Bathsheba. You are the man. So common sense tells us that there's only one victim here and one offender. Now, the fact that 80% of us are casting primary, if not equal, blame on Bathsheba is sending a clear message to survivors of abuse. I cannot go to my pastor. This is not a safe place, right? Because, I didn't cry out when my dad abused me, or I didn't do X or Y, or I've delayed talking about it for 5 years, so people will say that I'm somehow to blame, or another 100 factors that could be in play. And if we don't get the power dynamics right, we can never, ever have credibility working with, say, children who are trafficked. I've got a dear friend who gives lectures in the country about her history of being trafficked. She was abused by her dad. She ran away from home. She gets trafficked. And the person who owned her said, you have to submit to the following sexual acts at the hands of these particular people. And if you don't do it, I'm going to force you to be in films where you have sex with animals. So he would give her these horrible options here. And of course, the ultimate option was he would kill her. That is survival sex. She did not have a meaningful choice in this situation. We can also not witness effectively to persons of color who have slavery in their ancestry. Read a good biography of Sojourner Truth or in any of the great pioneers in the slavery era, and many of them had a mother who was bred and was told by an owner, you have to have sex with this person. This person is your husband this year, because they were being bred. And many persons of color, when I dialogue with them, they understand that history, and they get frustrated when pastors say, oh, she had a choice. How do we know that she wasn't hot for the king? We're just reading all that stuff into it, when I think the inspired writer is making it clear to us, saying, could we just apply a little bit of common sense here? I mean, what options did she have? Her husband was away at war. She's inside the palace. Who's she supposed to call out to, right? What choice did she really have in this situation? It is a violation of the eighth commandment to cast equal or primary blame on her when there's not one iota in that text that allows us to do that. And that is a sin we've engaged in for a long time. And the devil has used that poor theology to keep survivors of abuse from going to their pastor, because they don't think their pastor gets it. So
Yeah.
that's how much is at stake here.
Yeah. Let's continue that line then, and we'll come back to the question we kind of started with. How does this kind of trauma specifically like physical and sexual trauma, how does that distort a victim's view of God's character? Like, so what's the spiritual impact of these things?
First, let's put it in perspective. Research says more than half of victims are wounded, not just physically and emotionally, but also spiritually. So this is a really big dynamic.
And
Um,
can I
yeah,
also ask the
yeah,
follow up? What I'm not sure I have a great grasp of what um what a spiritual wound is even.
sure. Um, Academics make a distinction between religiosity and spirituality. Spirituality is this broad concept, my connectedness to the universe, something bigger than I am. Even an atheist can be spiritual in that broadest sense. Religiosity has to do with my specific beliefs and creeds. I'm a Christian. I believe in a triune God. I'm Lutheran. I adhere to the doctrines in the Book of Concord. For most survivors of abuse, though, religiosity and spirituality is more like a bowl of yarn. It's all rolled up together. And the challenge of a pastor or someone else working with a victim who's spiritually impacted is to untangle that ball of yarn and see how they've been wounded spiritually or religiously. So that's what we're talking about. Now, how is a victim wounded spiritually? There's at least three dynamics in play. Most perpetrators, not all, but most perpetrators incorporate a religious theme into the abuse of a child. Probably close to 100% of religious leaders, clergy offenders, incorporate a religious theme, but even many non-clergy incorporate a religious theme. So, for example, in the Caring Well report, one of two investigations on the decades of child sexual abuse in the Southern Baptist Convention, there's an account where the offender says to the boy victim, well, this is like Jonathan and David in the Bible. They had a special relationship, and that's sort of like what you and I have together. Um, I consulted on another case in a Protestant church where the pastor was abusing his daughter, and the girl says, this is sinful. We shouldn't be doing this. And the clergy person, the dad, says, well, there are exceptions in the Bible. In the creation of the world, in the book of Genesis, it was just Adam and Eve. God had to use incest to repopulate the earth. Same thing after the great flood. And sometimes God comes to us in a dream, like he did to Joseph. God came to me in a dream and said, our Christian community is under attack. We must repopulate from within. And sometimes God asks us to do sinful things that seem sinful, but there's really a hidden purpose. And then he uses, the analogy of God saying to Abraham, kill your son Isaac. It seems sinful, contrary to the fifth commandment, but God had a hidden purpose. Well, God has come to me and says, I have to touch you sexually to prepare you to be a mother. I don't want to do it. It makes me sick, but God says I have to do it. We have to bear our cross together. So those are just two of hundreds of examples I could give you of twisted theology being utilized to justify the abuse, to convince the child that God is somehow behind all of this. God is sanctioning it. But it gets worse. When the child does make an outcry, if they ever do, religious leaders, because they're not trauma informed, they often will twist theology to avoid protecting the child. So going back to the Southern Baptist Convention scandal and the Guidepost, the second of the two published investigations, there's this chilling email in their headquarters where somebody to the effect says, yeah, we're getting all these women saying we got pastors or, still in the pulpit, and yet they supposedly rape these women as children. But we can't really do anything about that because, that would undermine the cause of Christ, the spreading of the gospel, right? And, I got one woman saying, they were raped by this person. The Bible says I need at least two witnesses, right? And it's a local congregational affair. Or then the worst email where somebody says, this is really the devil, right? The devil is behind all of this to take us from our laser focus on spreading the gospel. So faith leaders will bend theology every which way but loose to avoid taking any action, or if they take action, it's the worst possible thing to do. And then the third factor is just the child's own individual struggles, right? Even if religion was not incorporating the abuse, the child may say, I prayed And I prayed and I prayed. I prayed every day for the abuse to stop, but Dad still kept getting drunk on Saturday and coming to my bedroom and touching me sexually. If God can part the Red Sea and raise people from the dead, why couldn't he stop my dad from drinking? Why couldn't he stop my dad from touching me sexually? Why? Right? Those really difficult questions that an individual survivor may struggle with. Viktor Frankl, a survivor of the Holocaust, said it's not suffering that's unbearable, it's suffering without meaning. And many of us turn to our spirituality to make sense out of suffering. And many survivors struggle with this, and they don't know where to turn for spiritual relief. So these three dynamics come to a head, and they cause profound spiritual damage. So here's the shocking lay of the land. We have built a Christian community where most perpetrators of abuse feel really comfortable in our pews because they're probably not going to hear a sermon on child abuse, probably not going to have it talked about in a Bible study. We're going to skip over things like Lot offering his daughters to be gang raped, if not killed. We're just going to skip over stuff like that. We're not going to talk about it. And so they feel really comfortable. And because we're poorly educated, we don't have personal safety education. We wouldn't know grooming if it was staring us in the face. They feel really comfortable. But for survivors of abuse, they don't feel comfortable. We don't talk about it. I don't see it in the sacred text, or maybe I find it in the sacred text, but then I read a Bible commentary, like, in my article, I was critical of the EHV Bible commentary and how they treated David and Bathsheba. You read stuff like that, and you say, I guess I'm not really a victim, right? If I didn't cry out or whatever the ugly commentary is. So they just don't feel safe, and they grow up and they walk away. But it doesn't mean they're not spiritual or religious anymore. What I see happening is survivors of abuse say the church is not a safe place for me, but I still need Jesus. I still need God. So they form their own network, their own community. They do their own Bible studies. They're searching for these answers, but they're going it alone. They are the lost sheep. And at some point, our heart needs to grow to the point where we say, we're going to go after them. We're going to start talking about it.
Yeah. And we should talk about what churches can do and institutions can do organizationally to promote, I guess, these safer environments. But before we do that, let me ask, if these are the 1 and 99 are tasked with going after them, how do we approach that, right? I can think of 100 ways I shouldn't, right? I'm not going to make you talk about things you don't want to talk about. I'm not going to keep, if you disclose to me something that happened when you were a child, I'm not going to keep bringing it up in conversation in order to try and tease it out of you or something. So how should we, first as individuals and then as an organization, let's go with churches, because most people listening are going to be members of a church at least. How do we effectively reach the one with the gospel and bring them back?
Yeah. We need to talk about it from the pulpit. We need to talk about it in Bible study. These are inspired texts, so God wants us to talk about it. And so we need to start talking about it. And you don't have to be explicit, right? The David Bathsheba account doesn't give us the details of the sexual exploitation, just that she was exploited. So draw that out appropriately. When you're talking about Joseph being sold into slavery, say this is what we would call trafficking today, right? Get right these ancient proverbs about hitting people with objects, and say this does not require us to hit our children. Things like that would create an environment where survivor of abuse would feel comfortable. I can talk to a pastor, I can talk to a teacher, I can talk to others about it. We need to implement in every single one of our WELS schools personal safety education. Again, our moral standards need to be lifted to the same moral standards of most public schools that already do this. We need to be at the same level of our friends in Catholic schools. It is not sex education, although I'd favor that too. That's a different subject to bring me back to talk about. But personal safety tells kids what they already know. They've got intimate parts of the body, and what do you do if somebody's making you uncomfortable, is giving you that icky feeling? What options do you have? It's teaching them to have some personal safety rules, such as we say to kids, develop a list of 5 people you could talk to if you're scared or uncomfortable, right? And it should be 5 because sometimes the person on that list is the one abusing you. Um, and so we empower them. What do you do if you're online and some man asks you to send a picture of yourself without your clothes on, and now all of a sudden the person is saying, well, you have to do more, or I'm going to send this to everybody at your church or school, and you know you did something wrong by sending the picture, and you're terrified to talk to your mom and dad or your pastor because you're just you're worried about what you did, but now you're in way over your head, and you're at high risk of something really horrible happening if you can't reach out. So creating an environment that if you get in over your head, this is a church, this is a school, these are moms and dads that will protect you, right? And you can come to us, which is why we also have to educate parents about these issues and what do you do if your child has been abused. You mentioned earlier what to say or not to say. A lot of times, because we're not trauma informed, we say, well, how come you didn't tell me till now, right? But if we're trauma informed, we know why it takes a long time to talk about it. Instead, we say, how can I help you? Let's figure this out together. You're not alone, those sorts of things. So all of our schools need to implement personal safety education, and it's not hard to do. There are a number of courses that meet research standards. We have one at Zero Abuse. I'm kind of biased. I like ours best, but there's a lot out there that you can choose from, and that needs to be a high priority. That's the number one thing we can do in our schools. Second,
Before you keep going, I'll
yeah,
also jump in on that and say on this podcast, now Pastor Zach Flunker did an excellent paper on sex education and did a great interview here as well.
wonderful.
It's a paper worth reading, and he does an excellent job of talking about it as well.
Yeah,
So if anybody's looking for an easy access resource
yeah,
there as well.
yeah,
Sorry, go
yeah.
ahead.
That's wonderful. And then we need to have policies. We have a lot of schools and churches that don't have any policies, or if they have policies, they're pretty weak. I was talking to a well school once, and I asked, "Do you have a policy?" And principal said, "Oh, sure we do." And he shows me a 1-page policy, 3 or 4 paragraphs, and I said, "That that's not a policy, right?" Any offender who reads that will know that this is a place that they can operate with little chance of detection. We need to do a deeper dive than that. So I recommend that you form a child protection committee. You work through the book, the Child Safeguarding Policy Guide. A lot of people call me and say, just send me the cookie cutter and we'll fill in the blanks. You can't do that because I got to figure out how big is your church? How many ministries do you have involving kids? Do you have a school? Do you have a preschool? What activities do you have off site? There's just a lot of questions that be sorted through. What's the layout of your building, right? Do you have big windows? Or do you have spaces that are not observable or not interruptible? Because those are the danger points for a child's most likely to be abused. So there's a lot of things to work through. But if you form a committee, you go through that book, it may take several months, but you end up in a better place. And then you send the policy to me or another expert for another go over. And then you got to keep that committee in place to make sure the policy is being enforced, that it's periodically reviewed and updated as new research comes down the path. You need to make a concerted effort of annual training where you're educating your staff about potential signs of abuse. It's going to take some effort, but you do end up in a much better place than where we're at now. And once you start to do it, it just becomes a way of life, right? So if you're going to say, we're going to go to this field trip to a museum, part of the conversation at the school is, what's our safety plan, right? How many chaperones do we have? How we're going to handle a bathroom routine at the museum. It just becomes a way of life. You begin to think about it at all times.
Yeah, and just speaking from experience, I think some of the pushback on implementing these kinds of policies and things like that is, I think it's a number of different things. I think one of which though is just like, oh, it's going to change how we operate. It's going to change everything. And first of all, none of those excuses are legitimate excuses. We wouldn't, and you brought this up earlier, right? We wouldn't We wouldn't make these excuses for anything else, right? We don't make these excuses about gunmen coming into schools. Like, even if we've never had a threat, we still have Alice drills and we take care of that. Why would we not address this issue here?
Yeah, can I add to that? So you
Go
mentioned
ahead.
gun safety. Many of our schools have taken efforts to protect kids from a shooting, which they should. I encourage that. And most of our schools have fire safety. But statistically speaking, you're much more likely to be abused in a school than you are to be caught in a fire or to have somebody come in with a gun. Statistically speaking, we've not protected our kids from the most significant risk that they're facing. But I want to make a theological point too. God is not mocked. God's been pretty patient with the Christian community, but at some point, the sin of failing to protect kids from abuse is so odorous in the nostril of our Creator that God will act, and God is more than capable of using the criminal justice system and or the civil system and journalists to bring down a theological house of cards. My friends in the Catholic Church watch the movie Spotlight. If you've never seen it, it's pretty accurate. They had great lawyers. They thought they had this under control, under wraps, but eventually God says, I've had enough. And, now they've paid billions of dollars in damages and multiple bankruptcies and shamed around the world. God is not mocked. When you read the Guidepost report, Southern Baptist Convention, they're listening to these high-priced lawyers. Oh, if we take any action, then we'll have liability. So the best thing to do is nothing at all, which is sinful, contradicts the teachings of Jesus to care for the least of these. And they got away with it for decades. But at some point, God said, I'm not going to be mocked anymore. And he used journalists in Houston to expose 700 cases of clergy abuse in that denomination. There's going to be a reckoning in our Lutheran communities as well. We don't need to go through each case, but the 8 cases in the Wells in the past year, at some point there'll be a journalist, at some point there'll be a lawsuit, at some point there will be a reckoning. It's really an issue of law and gospel. I've been advocating gospel. Care for children because God cares for children, and this was a big deal to Jesus, and Jesus will judge us one day. That's the gospel motivation. But if that doesn't work in your church or school, then maybe the law of motivation will. Because there will be a day when our institutions get sued. There will be a day when the media says, hey, they've known for a long time there's abuse in that denomination and have not implemented best practices, or there'll be something else. But God is not mocked. And if we don't right the ship, eventually God will hold us accountable.
Yeah.
Mercifully, it would be in this world. Unmercifully, or more fearsomely, it'll be on Judgment Day. But we will be held accountable.
Yeah. And you all explicitly say it. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when.
Yeah.
Right? It's not a question of if, even on an individual congregational level, it's not a question of if abuse happens here. It's a question of when, and it's probably already happening somewhere. Right. So let's make sure that we're prepared to address it. You make the case it's part of our vocation as individual Christians to be addressing it. Can you speak to that?
Yeah. It's always sad to me when we talk about evangelism that we don't pay attention to this research, because a significant factor in causing young people to leave the church is that we don't talk about this issue, and we've turned a blind eye to this sin for such a long period of time. So Lifeway did a study, and they found that 1 out of 10 Protestants below the age of 35 said, I'm out of here, I'm leaving the church. They don't get it, and they don't seem to care about it. It's not relevant to me. So we're peeling off a lot of folks every generation, and so we're not fulfilling the Great Commission. We're actually sending kids away from us when Jesus told us not to keep them away from our Lord. And so we're really hurting our church and contributing to our decline. That I think is the most important factor. We're also not serving offenders very well. Offenders need a good dosage of the law. They need a wake-up call. They often justify their misconduct by saying, oh, it's not that bad. So in the Catholic child sexual abuse scandal, researchers would talk to priests who molested boys, and they would say, well, it wasn't penetration, it was just fondling, and so it's a lesser sin, right? And offenders play that game all the time to justify their misconduct. They need to hear from the Pope, but there is no excuse when you stand before Christ one day, and you certainly can't blame the victim for your misconduct. So we're also not serving offenders very well either. We're also not creating an environment where offenders could get help. Pedophilia manifests itself almost exclusively in males and begins in those adolescent years. If we could create an environment where you're, 12, 13, 14, and you realize you're sexually attracted to kindergartners, where you could go to talk to somebody and get help, we might be able to prevent a large number of tragedies. So we're not serving victims, we're not serving offenders very well. We're also damaging ourselves in the eyes of the public. I have so many friends, especially those who were abused in the church, who think of us as an unholy place, right? That we're never going to get it. We're never going to take meaningful action. And so the church is simply irrelevant for them. So for all those reasons, we need to get engaged with this subject.
Yeah. All right. I want to bring up a couple of different things before we go here, and I prepped you on some of them. I didn't prep you on others, so I just want to hear what you have to say on a few of these things. The first would be, what would you say to somebody who's listening to a conversation like this? Maybe they go read a couple of the papers that we'll have linked down in the show notes below, and they come to the conclusion, yeah, I was wrong here. Right. My corporal punishment of my own children went too far. Decades ago, they're grown now. It went too far. I hurt them. Right. There was that one uncle in the family, and I was part of brushing this under the rug. Right. Whatever the story might be. Somebody who's now removed from the situation. Obviously, if it's a situation that's ongoing, stop, and now let's address it. But say it's something that's already happened. We're a couple of years down the road from it. You're looking back on it and realizing this was abuse and I participated in it. What word do you have for them?
Blessing. We're in Lent, season of suffering and repentance. And so repent of the wrong you've done, and then remember what we say in preparing for Holy Communion. I will right whatever wrongs I've committed. So our sanctification is, what do I do to correct what has been done? Is it saying to my son or daughter, I'm sorry I hit you that hard, right? Sarah McCannis from NPR wrote a really good book about why she left the evangelical community, and corporal punishment was one of them. She was beaten to the point of injury, and she said, I'm still in therapy today. If I were Sarah's mom and dad reading that, I'd say, I'm so sorry. I didn't fully realize what I was doing to you. I think that's a really good approach. If you had that uncle and you know that he committed acts of sexual abuse and it's not too late, maybe it is time to talk to a police officer or otherwise secure justice. Many offenses can be charged even decades later on if the government can prove it. And if there can't be justice, there still can be accountability, right? There still can be, hey, we can't allow him to teach Sunday school. We need to talk to the pastor or the elders saying, hey, I know Uncle Charlie molested my brother and my sister, or whatever the evidence may be. We need to do something to protect kids, and also for the sake of the uncle, right? Somebody should have a hard conversation with him about what does repentance look like. And if somebody's truly repentant, they're not going to want to teach Sunday school, or they're going to want checks and balances around them to reflect that their heart is going in a better direction. So what can we do going forward to be safer?
Yeah. Okay. What if I'm an individual who's either coming to the realization, well, no, I'll phrase it this way. I see myself heading in this direction, right? I'm starting to get like ideations and fantasies that I know are wrong. Perhaps I'm, to take it in the physical side, right? My behavior with my own children or with the children, the children I'm coaching or whatever it is is getting, I'll say closer. After this conversation, I hesitate to use this phrase, but getting closer and closer to the line, right? I'm seeing myself trend in that direction. What would you say to that individual?
This year, my annual lecture at Martin Luther College, because of the cases we had in the wells in the past year, and I realized some of these alleged offenders probably were sitting in that class in previous years. So I added to my teaching this year, if you are having sexual thoughts about children, you should not go into a teaching ministry. You're just flying too close to the flame, right? And you need to talk to an appropriate mental health provider and perhaps a spiritual care worker and figure out a game plan of how we're going to manage these thoughts so that you don't act upon them. I love when Martin Luther said, we can't maybe stop the bird from flying over our hair, but we can stop the bird from nesting in our hair. So let's figure out a game plan that this bird never nests in your hair and you actually end up abusing a child. If you're tested and the provider says that you meet diagnostic criteria for pedophilia, that is a form of mental illness, it's not curable. Presently, it's not curable. Just like alcoholism is not curable, but we can teach you how to manage it, right? We would never say to an alcoholic, bartending is a good job for you, right? But we can help you manage it, right? And we can give you a support system. Who do you call at 2 a.m. when you're thinking, I really want to try to access an image of a child being sexually abused? Who do you call so that you don't click on that image, right? It's going to take effort. It may be a lifetime process, but you're not going to be able to go it alone. And absolutely, it'll be difficult. But one of the resources I wrote is an article, literally "Bird in the Air, Nest in the Hair," and what is good pastoral care to somebody who has sexual thoughts about children but has not yet acted on them, and what we can do to support such a person. There are people who can help you, but don't fool yourself and say that you can handle it on your own, because you can't.
All right, 2 more. Victims of abuse who have not reported it. What would you say to them?
Don't blame yourself for not reporting. There are understandable reasons why you may not have reported. And there may be legitimate reasons for not reporting. The civil and criminal justice systems are not always supportive. Faith communities are not always supportive. There may be repercussions that justified you in not taking that action. So don't feel guilty about it. At the same time, it is important to take care of yourself and be aware of the potential medical, mental health, and spiritual impact of trauma on your body and your soul, and figure out who are safe people I can talk to. Is there a safe pastor, somebody who's demonstrated that they're trauma informed? Is there a good mental health provider who's fluent in cognitive behavioral therapy and EMDR and other evidence-based approaches that can be of assistance to me? Do I have a medical doctor who understands trauma research and how it could be impacting my health? Because if they're aware of this, they'll do a better job in recommending medications and sometimes lifestyle choices, right? So who do I bring into my inner circle who's trustworthy, who can help me figure out a good game plan for medical, mental health, and spiritual care? And when you do that, you may also change your mind about sharing, because you may have a fear that's not grounded in reality. I won't be supported, I won't be believed, but now I tell my doctor and a therapist and a pastor and they believe me and they support me. Maybe there are good and caring, decent people who would help me if securing justice is one of my goals. Or maybe you don't want to ever go through a criminal trial, right? But I do want children to be safe, and this person is still in a ministry or the like. Maybe there's something I can do through an ecclesiastical process to remove this person from ministry. But I can't figure that out by myself. I'm going to have to find some trusted people who can help me sort through better options. So don't blame yourself, but do find safe folks who can help you care for yourself and can help you make these really difficult decisions going forward.
All right. Last one. I did not warn you about this one ahead of time, but I'll toss it to you anyway. I'm part of that. So I'm 33, about to turn 34 this summer. So born in 1992. Part of that first wave of young men with just unrestricted access to the internet, right? And I can honestly say, I don't know of any men my age. They probably exist somewhere. I don't know of any men my age who did not have some sort of significant interaction with internet pornography at some point. Even if they somehow escaped the teenage years, it became a thing when they got a smartphone or whatever it might be. There is a lot of, by the grace of God, and to the praise or to the credit, I guess, of a lot of Christian institutions and a lot of brave Christians, there is a lot of material available, and there's a lot of resources available to men who are men in particular who are struggling with internet pornography. But I don't think we can talk about it enough. From the perspective of someone who's worked extensively with victims and even predators of sexual abuse and physical abuse, can you talk a little bit about pornography and its harm? Or I don't really know what your perspective would be. I have guesses, so I'll let you speak on the subject.
Why I'm in favor of healthy sex education in our schools, because as we go through puberty, we're naturally curious and our hormones are raging, and because it's so easy to access sinful material online, the temptation can be overwhelming, and many youth, both boys and girls, succumb to that. And then they don't know how to process what they've seen. But in healthy sexuality education, we can say, hey, what you're seeing depicted on film is not realistic. It's giving you an unrealistic depiction of sexual activity. And so it may be harmful somewhere down the road. We can talk about the addictive nature of pornography. It's releasing certain drugs in your brain, so you need a bigger hit. So it's harmful on multiple levels. And then also pay attention when you're watching these films. Look behind the lens, because most of the people depicted in these films are also engaged in survival sex. There's the reason they went into the sexual exploitation industry, because they were running away from homes where they were being abused, and they came to believe that's all they are worth, is a sex object. And many of them will lead very short lives. And so give a realistic depiction and an understanding that you're actually feeding an industry that thrives on the abuse of children and takes advantage of these people when they are of an adult age. So really, really understand the dangers and the harms. As a child protection professional, I would say an additional danger is offenders love pornography because they can use it in grooming, right? They'll show the child, oh, look at this picture, right? And if you're adolescent boy or girl, you may be curious, well, let's look at this. And then, do you think we could try something like that? So pornography, even if it's not child sexual uh, uh, abuse images, is nonetheless often used as grooming behavior in these cases. So the theological lesson is Jesus knew what he was doing when he said, don't, if you're lusting after somebody in your heart, it's the same as adultery. And he knew that this was dangerous to us at multiple levels. So healthy sex education in all of our Lutheran schools is something I would advocate for. And I would encourage moms and dads to have healthy conversations about sexual activity with their kids. I encourage mom and dad to think back when you were 12 or 13 or 14, right? How difficult were these things for you? And maybe you have a little more grace when your kids are struggling with some of these issues.
All right. Thank you, Victor. We're bumping up. We're close to an hour and a half together. The time has flown. Thank you so much for the conversation we've had. I'll toss it to you. Feel free to have the last word if you'd like it. Anything else you'd like to talk about or address before we go?
Thanks to you for carving out so much time to talk about this issue. I would say to everybody, sometimes we don't act because it seems overwhelming. I got to implement personal safety education. I talk about from the pulpit. I've got to, think of a safe ministry standard for all of my work now. It's just overwhelming. And I think another fear is uh, we know child abuse can be really messy. If we talk about it, oh my word, somebody may come in and say they're being abused by their mom or their dad, or their grandpa abused them years ago, and the grandpa is teaching Sunday school. It's messy, it's ugly. Churches may divide if we talk about it. So it's safer to not mention it. If those temptations are there, I would say with respect to the difficulty, there are a lot of people such as me who can help you sort through the difficulties so you're not alone there. And in terms of the messiness, you're absolutely right. But I think Jesus encouraged us to go into the messy parts of life because he did, right? He dined at the table of sinners. He was seen in the company of those who were sexually exploited. He was countercultural to his era. At one point, he says to his disciples, "You're going to leave me too. Everybody else is leaving me," right? Um, but the faithful remnant of Christ's followers are those who are okay with getting their hands dirty, because ultimately they know they're accountable to Jesus and they want to stand before Jesus with hands that are as clean as possible. And so that means we got to get our hands a little bit dirty in this world.
Thank you, Victor. Thank you for being on the show today. Thank you for the work that you're doing at Zero Abuse and all the other things that you're involved in. And as a future pastor, also thank you for all the resources that you've been participating in providing to men like me who are going out into the world that is messy, right? I like the way, I don't remember who said it on the podcast recently, but somebody on this podcast, a guest of mine, said recently that the primary vocation of men is to bring order to chaos, right? This is a chaotic world, a messy world, like you said, that we live in. What a blessed calling as men of God to be the ones who bring a little bit of semblance of order with the gospel. I mean, it's really the Lord doing the work, but using us to bring a little bit of order to a chaotic world. So thank you, Victor, for joining us today. If you, listener, want to be part of the Gird Up mission, you are in the right place. Hit follow or subscribe, leave a rating and review, and share this episode with someone who needs a community just like this one. If you'd like to support the work we do here at Gird Up, consider a cup of coffee donation. Go to www.girdupministries.com. Select buy us a cup of coffee and help us flood the internet with confessional content. And finally, if you've got questions, topics, or guest ideas, send them my way through the link in the show notes. I love you. God bless you. And I can't wait to talk to you again next week.
Thanks.